Good evening and welcome to another in the series Impact. And we have a special guest with us this evening. And we have someone who has worked with government and given over 30 years in public service. She is also a school governor and was awarded OBE in 2000. So we have with us Judy Clements OBE. Good evening and good day and welcome to Impact.
Good evening, Craig, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your series.
It's a pleasure. The first thing I want to know, you have been in the public service for over 30 years. Tell us about some of the things that you have done.
Oh, where does one start and how long do we have? From a child, I have always been very keen on public service. I've got, I think from childhood, I should say I'm a fifth generation Seventh-day Adventist, but from childhood, I've always had a sense of justice and wanting to do the right thing. So, and I always describe myself and my age group as being a child of the civil rights movement. So even though I was a child, I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated and the thirst of hunger to want to learn more about that. And I think my parents did a lot to stimulate that, particularly when they shared with us as children their experiences of coming to England, first of all, as professionals. My father was in fact a qualified pharmacist, and my mother a nurse, and having to retrain all over again and the challenges they faced. So for me, there was always the need to strive to not just do and be average, but to be better, to be the best, and to do the right thing. So I've always been driven. So it's no surprise I started off life as a police officer for 11 years in the West Midlands. And whilst doing that, I studied for my first degree, which they paid for, and then went on to study law, all part-time, because not having any family responsibilities, it wasn't too much of a challenge. So after those 11 years, I went to head up the country's largest crime prevention project with the Home Office. So straight into working with central government, which I've done throughout most of my working life. In 25 years in the criminal justice, liking to lock up the bad guys. And then I think it was 2003-04, I joined the Police Complaints Commission, and helped to set that up. It was one of the recommendations from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and that was looking into police officers who had also fallen foul of the law, and high profile cases, so police shootings, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So you have been in the public service with the police and with law and enforcement, and you moved on to the HMRC, being an adjudicator. What did that entail?
Yes, well, after 25 years of criminal justice work, I wanted to do something that was just as challenging intellectually, but different, and perhaps where death was less prevalent, death at the hands of the state. Although I saw enough cases where people were driven to the brink. Within HMRC as the Independent Adjudicator, my role was to investigate serious complaints against the department for their incompetence. I had 6 offices at one point, so staff all over the country. And I remember one year, there were a number of complaints were so bad, I upheld over 90%, and was very critical. My reports went to members of Parliament and the House of Lords, and were frequently commented on in the press. And this could be from, you know, the small business SME, small business owner, to individuals who are what's now known as universal credit, but tax credits at the time, where calculations get wrong or where people couldn't work. I think it was more than something like 16 hours before the tax credits reduced. And it was very, very challenging. And the way in which individuals were dealt with often left a lot to be desired. So it was my responsibility to hold them to account.
And you went on to doing ombudsman for education.
Yes, so that was looking at complaints against universities in England and Wales.
And presently you are Children's Minister, so is Director for the South England Conference of Seventh-day Adventist Church, and also governors for a few schools.
Yes, well, in 2018, I thought I had actually retired from public life, but obviously very passionate about what happens within my church, and was invited to be governor of Stanborough School. I was already a governor of 2 other independent schools, incidentally, also faith schools, one Catholic, one Church of England, high-performing schools. And then I happened to attend our South England Conference session, and lo and behold, was nominated for this role. I think largely I've got 11 years experience working with Barnardos and a lifelong experience in mentoring young people. I'm very passionate about that and work with children. So yes, I accepted the call, and that entails working with children in two respects: spiritually, helping to develop the growth and love for Christ, and not being afraid to live a life of Christ and demonstrate that to their peers. Children 0 to 12 is my remit. And as you well know, you sit there modestly, particularly given the pandemic. Most of this work would not be possible without your good self and the work of Bricks Kids. We've been able to take the gospel to children in their homes throughout the pandemic. And it's just an absolute joy to be able to work with you, your technical skills, your passion that you and your family have, Michelle and Janelle, for working with children. And, I must mention all the Bricks Kids as well and their families. So that's been a pleasure, and I'm hoping that work will grow. We know that you have been recognized in the US, so it's not just about me, it's about how we work together to take the message, the gospel, to more and more children across the globe. And that really excites me. And I have to say, congratulations to you and all the Bricks Kids who have just won the Little Heroes award recently for their achievements. So God is not sleeping, and it's good to see that.
Thank you very much, Judy. Yes, it's a pleasure working with you, and just being able to work together to impact children all over. And from hearing all of those things you have been doing over the past 30 years, no doubt you have impacted many lives and helped a lot of people. But you mentioned earlier at the start about your dad, you growing up in that period of civil rights, and your dad influenced you in supporting you in doing that. So let's go back to you as a child. Tell us about you in that early years of childhood. What was Judith like?
Very quiet. I was born in Guyana, and both parents had left me with grandparents. And then I came here when I was 8, because what they wanted to do was to come retrain, which they did, buy their own house, and then send for me. And after they both arrived, my brother was born. And in fact, at 3 months, they sent him back, because I think, being professional people, they had certain standards, not just spiritually, because they were both devout Christians from Guyana. So I came here as a quiet child, and then in school, one of the first things that I was faced with was overt racism and not being able to know how to deal with it. And I think the only way that I could retaliate, because we say sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can't hurt me. Well, that's far from true. So I used to retaliate with not so much the sticks and stones, but the belt that was holding up my oversized dress. And so when the head teacher complained to my parents, because I usually came out on top with the fights, I couldn't understand why they would be sitting me down and talking to me about non-violence, and which is basically what it was, and the fact that one had to pray. And then that's when my father started to share his experiences working in the NHS at the time. And how he had to deal with racism, particularly as he was a very clever man. In fact, he was the UK's first Black assistant matron back in the mid-60s. And he left and went into community relations work when he met the concrete ceiling, because after several attempts to apply to head up a hospital, I guess the country wasn't prepared for that. And he would talk about racism from the patients he treated and also from staff. He was also the third Black magistrate in the United Kingdom, again back there in the 70s. So I think seeing how against all the odds, it's possible to be successful, it's possible. And then he faced racism within the church. So family worship became much stronger. But as a family, we were able to talk openly about these things. And I think that's what helped me to have the calm disposition to have a different approach. Because one of the stints in the Home Office after I left the police service and the community relations, I did 4.5 years. In the Home Office with the Prison Service, a special advisor on race and diversity.
Right. So I've spoken to a few people already who have discussed about the impact that racism and coming from the Caribbean into this country have had on them growing up in school. Was there any teacher that kind of supported you during that time?
Not really, because there were very few role models. And I think that's where the importance of family was important, family conversations. I think without that, I may have struggled, because I saw lots of other parents who perhaps, or other children, peers, who didn't have that support network. So they would have ended up dropping out of school and, all around me. But I think because we had that love and that support, parents who took an interest, there was no such thing as coming home and not having homework, and the importance of education, but being aware of things that are happening around you and looking at what you can do. So, and that's why I think throughout the years I've mentored young people, both male and female, in terms of taking time to think, what do I want to contribute to this world? If it's about having a job to make lots of money, there's nothing at all wrong with that. But you need to take time to plan how you're going to do that. You need to get the right networking support structures, as well as the education to do that. And to be patient, because sometimes it will take time. You will have knockbacks, no matter how brilliant you are, even today. And for me, having that solid faith is what's taken me through.
So your dad and your parents, that communication, that family time was very important. Yes. No doubt, education was something that they fostered and ensured that you were always on top. What was it that they did differently, or especially that helped you throughout your education?
I think daily they took an interest. Dad often, do I say too much? Because sometimes he would end up being critical of the teachers, or if the teacher had overlooked something, because the style of teaching in the Caribbean and South America was very different, but very solid, and based on the British system, but he didn't rate the teachers. So I remember coming over, one of the things that he was concerned about, coming over at 8, I knew all my tables up to 12 and pretty much like the 15 and the 20, and then started to learn in between, and then started to forget them because it wasn't a daily thing. So he took on that responsibility. And I remember a couple of times getting a few pokes on the forehead, because I had failed, to overlook the spelling. Because what he used to do is say, you go back and look, something isn't right. And when you're looking at something for such a long time, you might overlook it. So I remember a few of those traumatizing pokes. And but also he did, or they did a lot in terms of books about Black history, and the guy who had what's his name, with the peanut, and then there was Drew, to do with the blood transfusion. Was it Carver, I think, to do with the peanut, and various Black scientists, and was it Coleridge, who it's believed Shakespeare stole a lot of his work. So Black artists and historians and people who had made a contribution to history in the way we now celebrate in October for Black History Month, that was part of the course. And I don't know where he got the literature from, and as well as the wider politics. So
he was always providing you with those literature for you to be not only telling you about it, for you to read for yourself.
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
And you reading that, how did that make you feel growing up as I guess, as a teenager now in secondary school, and seeing all these things happening around you, and reading the response of all these Black activists and scientists? How did that support you during that journey?
I think, Craig, it made me want to be determined to succeed and to make a difference to the world. So I've never been driven by the need to make lots of money, yes, to be comfortable, but it was always about this sense of a passion for doing what's right. So I think that's why I studied law in the end, social sciences, and then a law degree. And then when I talk about the knockbacks, I did a placement with a firm of solicitors in the North when I was contemplating, because I'd always worked and studied. And I remember we went into court with the QC to defend, I think he was a 24-year-old young Black man, and it was his 14th time in court for indecent assault on females in a car park. And he dressed so well, you would have thought he was counsel. And it was knowing that his antecedents and what he'd done, and it was the sheer brilliance of the barrister, because as they teach you in law, if your client says he or she's innocent, then you defend them. You're not there to judge or to try and point otherwise. And he was acquitted unanimously by the jury. And then I don't know about now, but in those days they weren't allowed to see the full antecedents. The only antecedents that were read out were all his traffic violations, and there were enough of those. So I remember thinking, I can't do this, because I had this principle thought in my mind that I would never defend rapists or men who abuse their wives, or mothers who had killed their children. I'd got this set fixed until I started to train and realize that that's not how it works. Right. And I could not pursue a career in law around that. Maybe I could have done the human rights stuff. But for me, what my concept of justice was completely shattered. So I had to rethink. So I think the nature of the work that I did after the crime prevention, the diversity stuff around race and diversity, it was then, okay, well, who holds the law enforcers, i.e. the police, to account? And that's why, and being on the steering group for the Stephen Lawrence, implementing the recommendations, I was there from the beginning to the end. And one of the greatest achievements of the recommendations for me was not the establishment of the Police Complaints Commission, which was unique worldwide, but double jeopardy, which means that if someone has been tried and acquitted of, say, murder, and later, providing the evidence is compelling, they can be retried. And we'd never had that before. That's enshrined in in British legislation. So, and I also sat on the Stop and Search Committee and chaired the Trust and Confidence one. So,
I mean, you would have seen it from an early age coming to this country, facing racism, and then you being in the police force. How did that? What was the impact of your working with them have in helping you with the jobs you have done in part in terms of being on chairing the IPCC?
Well, it meant that they couldn't pull wool over my eyes. I think having been a police officer and saw a lot of things, when I went as a director for the largest region, commanding the most staff at the Police Complaints Commission, as it was called then, a lot of my subordinates who worked directly to me were retired superintendents and chief inspectors who would never have had a black supervisor, never mind a female. And they tried certain things, but I guess where we'd got to, and I'd had a good boss that supported me in terms of their nonsense. I could deal with it most of the time. So, and also it meant that they wondered where, because when I joined them, it had been 15 years since I'd left the police service. It's not, and I had to make sure that they weren't being biased in favor of officers who were reported to the commission for wrongdoing and trying to make excuses for them. And I think now there aren't any ex-police officers, and that's the right thing. So you can't just retire with a big fat pension and then come in as an investigator thinking you're going to investigate your ex-colleagues when you're going to make excuses for them.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased that has turned around, because whereas I was objective, and being a police officer frontline was quite tough when you have your integrity, because I wouldn't condone, and there were certain things that they were afraid of, particularly on a Friday and Saturday night. And I found myself being posted in an office so that there was almost a fear that I got a line straight to Whitehall if they were found, kicking somebody's head in, as we would say at the time. I wouldn't have condoned any of that, regardless of whose head was being kicked in.
Right.
We were not supposed to do that in any way, shape or form. And because the reason I say that is because my dad, again, in terms of firsts, one of the jobs he had before retiring was the original Police Complaints Authority to look into police misconduct was established, and he was actually a member of that. So they felt uncomfortable because he had a daughter in the police force. And ironically, one of his early cases was to investigate the case of an accidental shooting of a 5-year-old boy in the Midlands. There was an operation that went wrong. They were after the dad, and the child was hiding under the bed, and the gun went off. And it was interesting because a few years later, that officer, and he still was in bits because he had a son of the same age, actually came to be my sergeant where I was posted at the time. So it was all, very interesting, but none of it perturbed me at all.
I mean, being with your dad being the first back in so many years, and moving up the ladder professionally, how did that help you to deal with your movement up the ladder and having to face, no doubt, racism, and not being probably the only woman to be in that position? How did that?
Yes, I think it was encouraging, I think, for all the reasons I said earlier. I think, and what this is a message for anyone is listening, in particularly young people, you need to be comfortable about your own ability and your own skills. You need to be honest. I always say, have that honest conversation with yourself. And if you can identify a mentor or somebody to take you through your CV, to talk about your future, etc., I think it's always useful to have that. So I've never applied for a job that I felt that I couldn't do. I think the most moving experience that I could share was when I applied for the Independent Adjudicator's role, because I ticked every single thing all the requirements. But the person who held the role at the time was, you know, the late Dame Barbara Mills, who was the first public prosecutor, DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, so heads up the Crown Prosecution Service.
Right.
And her husband, John Mills, actually, you know, to put it crudely, bankrolls the Labour Party, is given a lot of funding. So again, anyone would have thought, you know, don't bother. So I rang up the recruitment company, because I put the application in the bin 3 times with the advert, and I thought, no, they're not going to want me. They're going to want another dame or somebody who's knighted. I was at the Police Complaints Commission at the time. And they said, well, make sure, you know, that your covering letter addresses XYZ. I did exactly that. And that was in the November. I didn't hear anything till the end of January. So the number of times you give up, and even after being interviewed and leaving the interview after 50 minutes, where you were told it was an hour and a half, thinking they won't want me, to the phone call coming through to saying, you know, yes, it's all yours. And the word, you know, the voice of the Lord saying, and Judy, you dare to doubt me yet again? I told you I would come through for you. You just leave it to me.
During that time, you know, your professional career, what do you think was the greatest impact you had someone who impacted you during that time? Did you have a support network? Apart from family, did you have tutors, bosses who, you know, made a difference to your life?
Yes, I'm just trying to think. Yes, I have got one friend who, Dr. Marie Stewart, who was always there to talk through things, look at my CV and, you know, comment, because I think I do this naturally for other people, but it's nice when you're up there to have someone, you know, that can do that. But it was really difficult because everybody was struggling. And often people don't necessarily have the same ambition. And I wouldn't say it's a naked ambition. It's about the opportunity to make a difference and being able to go for it. So I think I've been inspired. I think my faith is deep, but in terms of the real world, I have to say it's been externally with people like Mandela. And then I was at the police complaints. So early before that, I would be struggling. I would be struggling. So certainly Mandela and the long walk to freedom. His book is very, very powerful. And then I just got a new sense of fire in my belly, whatever you may think of his politics. But when America actually elected Barack Obama, and the intellect and the way that he's been able to get the words across, I think what is, and I hesitate in using the word disappointment, because when you're part of a democracy, it's to fully understand how it's not just about you, unless those around you, it's the same, we have a parliamentary system here, support you, and the struggles and the battles that he had just to get some form of healthcare through, for example, for people who couldn't afford it, versus the greed of those, you know, the insurance companies, etc., and politicians who didn't want him to succeed on the opposite side. So again, for me, it was showing just how tough, no matter how brilliant you are intellectually and what you want to do.
So it was, you know, even though you were moving up the ladder, you had all these high profile jobs and you were doing so much for public service, you were still inspired by these external forces, men who you have seen, you know, come through the odds to support you, you know, helping you to move, to be even pushing on further.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because as I said, it's very lonely there. And when I looked around at that level, even within the networks, there are no people that looked like me. once I'd got within there, you know, there was a network of people where you're suddenly on the same level, but nobody was proactively helping to push you up. And my message to those watching is not to be afraid, but to be realistic about what you are able to do, and have your networks outside, because if and when it goes pear-shaped, or when the going gets tough, that's when you will need people outside.
You talk a lot about your dad. Tell us about your mom and the impact she had on you.
Yeah, my mum, we lost her in 2012, sadly. She was a trained nurse, and she was very, very quiet, a spirit of calmness within the home, very warm lady. And she served in church as a deaconess. And when she retired from nursing, she went to head up one of the first in London sheltered homes, or homes for Black elderly, in Brixton, called Lee Samuel House. So when Lee Samuel House opened, it's not far from your church, she was the first warden, so to speak, to look after people, and it was something she always wanted to do. And I think had she lived longer, she wanted to do more in terms of counseling and working for the church. So yes, Mum was that very calm, influencing spirit on all of us.
So what would you say you would have, apart from being very calm yourself, what else do you think you have taken from your mom? Are you more like your mom or your dad, you think?
I wasn't always calm. I was always very kind of fiery, gritty, probably more like my dad overall, in terms of a steely determination in wanting to make a difference and always finding a way. I think where Mum comes in with the calmness and that trait is in helping to navigate a way through when people might not be listening or sharing the values and things that you want to do. And sometimes you have to take a step back, and she would say, well, pray about it. And I can hear her in my mind saying that now, which means being patient, and I'm not very patient.
You're a mother yourself. How do you think you have, what did you have you taken from your parents that you are now using as a parent yourself?
Yes, well, she is a full-grown adult now, but I think that interest in the homework and education. So for me, it wasn't negotiable in getting her into a good school where hard work was expected. It was the norm. Homework from pre-prep was the norm. And making time for my daughter throughout, even when sometimes after a 12-hour shift, and I dreaded this time of year for the nativity play, particularly if something difficult was going to kick off at work, because I remember a couple of occasions where I had tiptoed into the hall with the lighting after 5-10 minutes after the nativity play had started, and being pointed out, Mummy, Mummy. So everybody knows that my daughter's mum has arrived late. Yeah. So I make her laugh about that even now, but I still remember regularly reading to her, and I think fortunate, because when she was 3, sadly, sometimes family relationships break down, and I became a single parent and moved from the Midlands to London. And there was a period of 4 or 5 years when, with au pairs and nannies, I also got my parents to move in, so that when I started, I say, to work away from home a lot, it wasn't being away for long periods. It might be a couple of nights or what, that the extension of me was there. So I was able to to do my work in comfort. Not everybody is that fortunate.
Yeah. And no doubt that period where you became a single parent had an impact on, you and your child. How, apart from, your family moving in, what other things did you have to do to deal with that breakdown in the family?
I think it was important to always be there and to talk to her about the fact that sometimes mummies and daddies don't always get along, but children also can see things for themselves, and they process and they understand. But it's letting her know every single day that she's loved, to the point where I'm still told, at her being 25, that I'm overprotective and I necessarily. So I think it's about showering them with love, but not overcompensating to be a parent, and where correction is needed, but making sure that children have plenty of activities to do. And again, the school that you're able to put them into will determine that. So it's not just all academia, but things like music. I mean, last evening I had the pleasure of going to see the Chinook Orchestra at Royal Festival Hall, which is an all-black orchestra, and it was nice to see young classical musicians there. So she is very strong in music. She was in the school orchestra, and then she was also in the it's called the Combined Cadets. She rose to become a sergeant in the Army Cadets, and I used to enjoy watching them on Remembrance Day parading, and often I would go and watch them on parade when I managed to finish work early. So it's being present consistently.
And it's also that conversation you have, letting them be aware, not shying away from what is happening, but, being open and up to them and letting them know that, love is still there regardless.
Yes, and when they're hurting, that apart from granddad, that Jesus is there. Because sometimes it's difficult for them to process that. But every Friday night, we have worship and so forth. So she's grown, and to be proactive within the church from a young age, which again is something both you and I are working on, and trying to encourage people. But you can't just expect children to be in church of their own. You have to take an interest and encourage them and be there.
Yeah, I want to get on to your role now as the Children's Ministries Director for the South England Conference of Seventh Adventist Church. I mean, you have a wide remit of impacting children all over the south of England. How do you do that?
Well, as you know, we have various programs that we put out for them, and what we take advantage with kids of the seasonal activities, starting with Easter. Then in the summer we have camp meeting, and we've not been able to do that now. In fact, since we started, we've not been able to have a live camp meeting, because it was September 19 and then 20 when we were elected in 19. So camp meeting had gone last year, and it looks as though we're preparing for a virtual one. And then there's VBS. Interact is, I don't believe in reinventing the wheel. So working with the church structure and departments that are already engaged. So the obvious one is Pathfinders. Next year, hopefully, we might look to do something with family ministries, and look at how we can build and enhance those programs. There are a number of emphasis days. So, for example, last year and this year, we've just had Orphan and Vulnerable Children's Day, Week of Prayer. We've just done the joint project where we get the children to do the reading, and coming up in January, we've got 10 days of that. So we will identify individuals so that helps to build their confidence and they can be seen. And it is tough trying to reach, and by God's grace next year, hopefully we can do a number of days of fellowship, but on an area basis, so that we're able to reach across the South England Conference, because it is so diverse that communities tend to become polarized and stick together. So you don't get the diverseness and richness of the communities actually coming together. And that's the difference I want to make.
You, you also have the remit of keeping the children and families safe as part of your remit as a Children's Ministry Director. What are the challenges you face in doing that, especially with the pandemic?
Yes, keeping the church family safe is the safeguarding remit. And I've had to be consciously careful that that doesn't overtake the spiritual development work, because sadly with the pandemic, we've seen a huge proliferation of domestic violence, which severely impacts our children in families, and also violence against children within the homes. Abuse in particular is very prevalent, and sadly the Adventist Church is not immune from that. So it makes life very, very difficult. The remit includes advising pastors and designated safeguarding leads, etc. Yeah, it's very intense work.
I mean, you have done the work in the public service, in government, in the prisons and the police, and now you're working with children. Is there a parallel you find? Is there similarities, or what's the difference between the work you have done in public service in the prisons and so forth with the children you're working with now?
I think one of the sad things in the criminal justice system is that when children get separated from their families, and I know women in prison struggle with this tremendously, it leads to depression and self-harm. And I think government needs to do more to support organizations in the third sector, like the Prison Reform Trust, to be able to inject more funding to support these women, particularly if they're incarcerated far away from home. I think the difference in the church when it comes to abuse, what saddens me is I think there is a tendency for denial, and that's one of the battles that I'm up against, particularly a reluctance to call in the authorities, which we're duty bound to do. So as part of that work, we've developed a comprehensive training package based on our British Union policy. And I sit on the advisory group for the British Union conference on this. Safeguarding, and it's about training officers. So no one in our church who holds an office, for example, should all have a DBS check. And it's making sure that we're vigilant, recognizing signs, but also having displayed numbers prominently in our churches, so that both children, young people, and even adults who may need help know where to go and seek that help. And we will be starting to roll out that training at the beginning of 2022.
So there's a training and education of our members and people to make them aware. Now,
our pastors, Craig.
And our pastors, yeah, definitely. Because that's not something I think in the past pastors have been trained up with. They're just focusing on preaching the gospel, but pastors have so many different roles now, so they need to be educated. We're almost coming to an end, but I want to touch on one of your greatest achievements that is being awarded, the OBE. Tell us about that.
Well, that was a shock to me as anything else, and because that came at the beginning of 2000 when I was just leaving the West Midlands. I had, in fact, one of the things, I chaired the Children's Hospital Trust there, and it says for community work in the West Midlands, and maybe one of the catalysts was success in winning a government bid from the Millennium Commission for just under 1.5 million to give to individuals as bursaries to do various projects within the city of Birmingham. So it could have been setting up their own theatre or dance groups or things, to support the community. And that's high risk, giving bursaries to individuals to do something. Just the administration of setting all that up and being able to do that very successfully without any fraud, or I was lucky to have a good team, a small team on board, and maybe that was the driving force. I'm still puzzled as to who put my name forward, and I recall as my family, as we drove into the palace, you know, they said that one thing you can be sure, you're here not because of you and what you brought yourself here, but it's obviously what somebody else has done. So I'm grateful to God, but it doesn't and never has defined who I am.
Now, I mean, not many people might have heard or know that you have your OBE. I'm always curious about when you have an OBE. What does that say? What does that do for you? What happens?
It means Officer of the British Empire, and I think somewhere in my safe I have the medal. So if there are formal occasions at the palace or wherever, you're supposed to wear it. I've never used it or abused it. It's, as I use it strategically, but you are supposed to display it after your name, and it took me a while to get used to that. So I see it as a blessing in many ways, as God for work that one has done. So yeah.
No, it's you are the first OBE I've interviewed, so I'm privileged to interview you. You have done a lot. Obviously, you must have time for yourself. And what do you do for fun? What do you like doing when you're not working, when you're not having all these things to contend with in the work world?
I'm a great reader. And one of the things when I finally retire, I'm hoping to be able to write. So in fact, quite late last night, I purchased just under £200 worth of another set of books to read through. So I'm an avid reader, both of Christian books, but contemporary things around politics and what's happening. But I love the theatre, in particular musicals. I think we've seen most of them. And I like, well, the cinema is probably 2 years. Oh, I did manage to go and see the matinee of 007. I'm a great fan. And I find TV relaxing, but I don't watch soaps, for example. They tend to be certain things, maybe medical dramas or law enforcement dramas. So FBI, I miss SWAT seasons off. So yes, it helps me to relax. So nothing dramatic, but
so you love to read, you love to go to the cinema, love to listen to music. What about food?
And to cook. I'm a foodie, but my daughter's taken that over because she's a great cook. So with working from home most of the time, it seems as though I've reverted to wash up. But if we are having we tend to share the responsibility. But yes.
What's your favorite food?
My favorite food is actually pasta from a place called Vapiano's, with onions and cheese grated on top, and salmon.
So you love your music, you love your food, you love to read. What else do you do for fun?
What else do I do? Walking twice a week. I have a good friend not far away, and we've been doing early morning walks or lunchtime walks in the park not far away, and I'm hoping that pandemic lifts, we'll be able to do, I'll be able to go away for these, days where you go away for 2 or 3 days and you do hikes, that kind of thing.
Okay.
I also like art galleries. So, yeah.
So you mentioned writing. What genre are you thinking of writing?
I will probably maybe start off with a biography looking at different aspects of my life. What it was like growing up here from my perspective, and then develop some themes from experiences and that's happened within, when I've worked within law enforcement, for example, and then contrast some of the themes of the different kind of experiences within working within central government. And yeah, I mean, there is enough that's happened to develop that into a play or some kind of drama, which we don't have time to talk about. Some of it's too serious, so I'd have to probably check when
Okay.
we're going to talk about that. But yes.
So, as we come to an end, what would be the legacy you want to leave after you have finished life on this earth?
I would like people to be able to say, I would like to be more like her in terms of wanting to make a difference in whatever job you've got that you do. Yes, so in terms of the HMRC, there are a number of changes, probably too many to articulate, but we can find those in the archives in terms of how the work is done and the attitude to which civil servants deal with people and their complex lives. I think I made a mark in turning that around, because not only holding them to account, but having to pay out compensation. I think, forget how many million, over 5 million, I think, in compensation that year when I upheld a number, over 90% of complaints. Just being able to say, yes, she was able to support me, and because of her, and I know there are individuals, where they feel that they wouldn't have got, it wasn't beyond their capability, but for me, they just need somebody to be able to say, you can do this, go for it.
And so I'm sure you continue to inspire, to impact children and adults with your life, with what you're doing even now. And one word for the children out there who might be listening, or a parent who, might find it difficult, children having struggles in schools with racism, whatever it is, what would you say to them?
Don't be afraid to follow your dream. And find somebody that you can talk to so that you don't lash out, because sometimes that can backfire and you can get into more trouble. So don't be afraid to follow your dream, but find somebody that you can talk to. It's very important.
And I just want to thank you very much for joining us today, Judy. It was a pleasure learning from your experience and hearing of all the lovely things you have been doing over the past 30 years and continue to do today. I hope that you will continue to be blessed and continue to bless others.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for having me as your guest. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and Bricks Kids in doing more for our children.
Thank you. So there you have it, Judy Clements OBE. Remember, lives are influenced by your living, so remember to live right and trust God. Until then, see you next time. Bye.